Hello everyone, after eating an entire gallon of ketchup, I wanted to make a quick video to help showcase how tank mitigation is calculated and to show people how to assess tanks based on various traits and attributes.
Follow my Twitch, you animals.
Since I was a young stud with luscious flowing locks, it's been a pet peeve of mine to see misinformation spread around that causes confusion, incorrect player concepts, and even straight up discourages people from playing different classes and specs that they may shine in. This, of course, isn't restricted to just the tanking world. I always think it's important to think outside the box and fundamentally make educated choices instead of just always following a meta because someone told you to. Even if the meta may prove to be right for you in the end, at least you'll understand why you came to that decision. For those of you that have never met me, hello! It's been a while. I've been playing WoW since vanilla and switched from being a noble rogue that stabs you in the back first available chance while leveling to main tanking at the end of Old War and Wrath of the Lich King. I've been main tanking in high-end hardcore raiding content for a few expansions now, swapping through different classes as needed through the tiers. And that's really been one of the most important drives for certain players, including myself, that we will visit later. Playing whatever is needed / best for your guild, strat, whatever it may be. One team, one dream. Now I must mention, if you've come here for a tier list, then I hate to disappoint you, but you can 180 that little tookus right out the door. I've never been a fan of tier lists. They tend to cause more problems than they solve, and a few of them over the years have been questionable, at best. The goal of this video is to help you understand how to rank your own tanks, or better yet, how to decide what is best for your situation. I do want to finally add that we will focus on raiding here primarily, although calculations and concepts apply to the minigame plus, I mean Mythic plus of course, as it's all under the same umbrella of PvE. Every tank has strengths and weaknesses, and the level of these vary based on the content type and tuning. Sometimes things are pretty well balanced, and other times one tank can be a little too weak or dominant, monks in BFA. Although not a fully exhaustive list, the general areas of focus for tanking include mitigation amount, just exactly how much of a hit do you shave off in damage. Next is tanking / mitigation uptime. How frequently do you tank and or need to mitigate damage? Generally this ranges from 50 to 100% in raiding situations. Some tanks can deal with spikes really well, but can't sustain a high level of mitigation for that long. A good example of this is a warrior with shield block, which baseline as in unaffected by legendaries, etc., and with some decent haste has an average shield block uptime of about 50 to 55%. Compare this to a paladin with a shield with a righteous uptime of 90% plus under similar circumstances. Of course, there are some ignore pains scattered in there every 3 GCDs or so on average for the warrior, if not used on revenge, much like excess resources on a paladin can be dumped into Word of Glories. The active time needed to mitigate damage may be short enough that the gaps in mitigation don't really matter much for bosses like Shriekwing, or they may be lengthy enough where you might start leaking raw hits like from Sludgefist or my uncle. Moving along, self-healing varies wildly between tanks, with blood DKs near the top and warriors near the bottom. Some people like to put absorb such as ignore pain as a mitigation, while others consider it a self-heal, seeing as it's an absorb. Doesn't really matter how you consider it, but for the purposes of this video, let's classify such absorbs like Celestial Brew as self-healing. Next topic! Access to CDs. Some tanks excel at frequent access to personal CDs that could prove very powerful in some instances, such as Demon Hunters with Demonic Talented Feldev and Legendary build Fiery Brand. Consider also Guardians with a CDR Barkskin build and their respective Legendary, and compare that to something like Paladins, which have powerful but more scarce CDs, or especially Monks, which nail that scarcity even harder. Let's talk about DPS output. We have seldom faced a reality where all tank damage is equal across all fight types, such as single versus multi, and sustain versus burst. Although as expected, and especially towards the end of expansions, barring some insane external system like corruption, tank damage is not nearly as impactful as the DPS roles. However, there are enough examples where tanks can excel in damage, and when you're pushing top level content, every bit counts. As such, there is a notable difference between something like blood DKs, even if they are paid by those shady demo locks, compared to Guardians and Pro Paladins, especially Venthyr. Let's talk about mobility. Though not always of huge importance, there are times where mobility shines and is very sought after for tanks. That value can range anywhere from a small convenience, like getting from point A to B slightly faster, to almost mandatory, like avoiding debuff applications on pre-nerf SLG. Listen, you may not like it, but pre-nerf SLG is what the pinnacle of fights and perfect raid encounters looked like. And finally, we come to utility / support, an important trait that can largely influence tank and melee DPS choice with their limited raid spots and overwhelming supply of specs. If you've ever watched my Twitch stream, it's no secret that I utterly hate the unique buff-debuff design system that continues to plague the game. It creates a situation where only the greatest and hottest specs can enter the limited capacity club. Sorry survival and enhancement, no entry for you tonight. Therefore, there's already a huge advantage to any class that provides a unique buff or debuff like Monk, Demon Hunter, and Warrior. Raid CDs further prove to be an important asset as well, so things like Rallying Cry, AMZ, and Ashen Hallow are sought after too. Stampeding Roar is a bit less important now than it was in Kil'jaeden Tomb of Sargeras days, as there are many alternatives to it. Finally, general support and utility can be pretty big on some fights, such as immunities and grips. Just remember, you may think you can bring the player, not the class, but so did this guy. So think again. Even at the highest levels, you can make most tank situations and encounters work with every tank's toolkit, from melees to tank busters. Oftentimes you want to look beyond just which tank can survive easiest, as on most encounters they are within reasonable distance of each other. Here are some things to consider. Is there anything they can break different mechanics with, whether they're tank or raid related? Does the raid need a buff or debuff? Is there a tight DPS check? Do I look cool playing it? Can they make a mechanic much easier to deal with? Always think outside the box. The later you get into the raid, the more important this becomes. Bosses such as KT and Sylvanas are way more important than Terragru and the 9. Ever wonder how mitigation values are calculated in WoW? Well, neither do I! Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty. There exist a few different types of damage that you'll typically encounter. These can be physical or magic, burst or sustain such as dodds and bleeds, and personal versus AoE, which avoidance effects. Generally speaking, all magic and bleed damage ignores armor, and therefore has a more profound effect on tanks that don't have as much damage mitigation modifiers for pure damage types. Now when I say pure damage types, I mean modifiers that affect all types of damage. Let's talk about how mitigation is calculated in WoW. Warning, by the way, if middle school algebra was beyond you, then this is where you can get a few more dailies in on your Havoc Demon Hunter while the rest of us continue. This is a topic that I believe leads to a lot of misconceptions, since these calculations are not something that are commonly known or readily available via in-game teachings. Combine that with the possibility of having a certain memory towards a tank's strength or weakness from a previous expansion, and it's easy to have a false fact presented like, DK is the best magic mitigating tank, or prop paladins are the squishiest tank. Before we dive into it, it is worth mentioning for posterity that the tanks have differing stam multipliers that lead to varying health pools. You can see these up on the screen right now. Obviously, there are some talents and stats that can boost these as well. Although important in calculating survivable hits and EHP, or effective hit points, or effective health pool as some people refer to it as, the difference in a fully buffed HP monk versus a DH in heroic eye level gear in Sanctum is in the rough range of 20k, which considering their mitigation profiles is not phenomenal. However, top-end HP is important to note in doing any kind of math when trying to survive tank busters or larger damage spike overlaps. A second quick note must be given on dodge and parry on average against boss level mobs. Let's call it evasion chance. Generously, we can call it an even 20% across all tanks passively, though it's a bit high of an estimate, with the exception of demon hunters with demon spikes active adding another 15% for its duration, and of course monks with elusive brawler stacks varying a lot over the course of an encounter. For this video, however, we're focused on how to calculate mitigation numbers, which are key versus non-evadable large tank hits like Painsmith's weapons. The first part we need to know is that mitigation is calculated multiplicatively and is not additive, otherwise you'd be running around with literally indestructible tanks stacking damage reduction. That would be as crazy and insane as making, say, oh I don't know, tanks gain AP based off of damage taken. What a crazy concept. If you want to word this out in your head, it's essentially damage mitigation source 1 mitigates this much damage, then damage mitigation source 2 mitigates this much of the remaining damage taken, and so on per mitigation source. To present this a bit cleaner in mathematical form, it would look something like this, as you can see on the screen, where X is the initial unmitigated hit, and C and D aren't just my average grades in high school, but are also examples of mitigation values such as armor and shield block. For any extra mitigation value that belongs, you just add another mod segment. Important to note as well that anything stacking with itself still remains as its own mod category, such as Rend and Tear for bears, it is 6%, not 3 different instances of 2%. Damage comes in 2 major types: physical, which is almost always mitigated by armor and always mitigated by pure damage modifiers, and often but not always blockable. Second is magic/bleed damage, which is not affected by armor, is unblockable aside from Holy Shield and largely non-evadable, and is mitigated by any pure damage modifier such as demonic wards for demon hunters, or magic only modifiers for magic of course, such as spell reflect for warriors. There is a less common third type of damage known as emotional damage, which is often present in resto druids, but since this video is focused on tanking, we won't be diving too much into that. Let's run through an example for Guardian Druids versus a sizable physical hit at 239 eye level. Let's say the baseline hit is 110k physical, and let's also assume that 2 stacks of Iron Fur are active, which puts armor at 60.01%. Other sources of mitigation, let's say, include Rend and Tear at 6%, Thick Hide from Bear Form for 6%, Ursine Adept for another 10%, and finally, let's assume that they use Bark Skin with the Legendary for a final 30%. Using the above formula, the mitigated hit can be calculated as follows, and once all that math is done, the initial 110k hit from the boss gets mitigated down by 77.7% to a roughly 24.5k hit. Now let's use the same Guardian mitigation for an example magic hit of 39k. Note that now the 2 stacks of Iron Fur will not be included since armor does not mitigate magic damage. The calculation is now as follows. You can see just how much more dangerous magic damage is for tanks versus physical, with only 44.3% of it being mitigated this time, and the vast majority of that is from a cooldown use. Magic damage has gotten a bit more tolerable for the tanks ever since they all received a passive 10% pure damage mitigation buff a few weeks back in light of the Demon Hunters getting a bug fix for its double dip on magic mitigation, setting it now just at a passive 20% pure mitigation. This came with some weird misconceptions as well, such as, oh, this tank is now so much better than this other tank because of the 10% mitigation buff it got, when in reality the net buff to all tanks didn't really much change the hierarchy, aside for Demon Hunters closer joining the rest of the pack, but they do of course all mitigate a bit more pure damage now. In fact, if you want to get specific, lower mitigation tanks like Blood DK benefited more mathematically from this change than did higher mitigation tanks like Paladins. Now that we've seen examples of how to calculate mitigation versus the 2 main damage types, you can use the math to apply it to anything in the game and therefore get a general sense of how each tank can perform when mitigating certain attacks. You can also start more accurately modeling available cooldowns for big hits if you know their relative frequency, so you can plan ahead if you need an external or if your own kit will suffice. It's important as well to showcase the tanks side by side to grasp the general idea of their capability to mitigate damage. While this does not show the full in-game picture as it doesn't consider tanking uptime or some effects of self-healing, etc., it does establish a solid foundation for damage intake profiles. The above base hit values used in the Guardian example were no coincidence, both because the majority of WoW players are furry lovers, so a bear was used, but also because they are actual examples of boss hits from Sanctum of Domination, with the first one being from the Terragru and the second one being from Ner'zhul. These are against tanks which are consistently kept at 239 eye level for easy comparison. A quick note here, as thrilling of a stat as versatility is, it was kept at 0 for each calculation, where in reality most tanks have about 5 to 10% extra mitigation from it, which is easy to math in based on the above formula, should you want to. So here of course are all of the mitigation values with the assumed numbers, the physical mitigation amounts under different circumstances, and of course the magic counterpart below it as well. You shouldn't apply chances of mitigation to major infrequent hits like a tank buster that lands every 45 seconds, for example. This is because if you're guaranteeing something like a paladin or warrior blocking / crit blocking respectively for that, and the block roll fails, well then you're gonna get nailed. Just like I nailed your mum. Across several frequent hits, however, it's more mathematically sound and reasonable to consider that you will indeed be blocking an appropriate percentage of the hits. From the charts we can see that monks have a very low value as well, but it is important to remember that stagger translates their post-armor hit into a 10-second damage over time that ticks every 0.5 seconds. It doesn't actually mitigate the value. Furthermore, only a portion of this remaining dot is actually eliminated via Purifying Brew, while the rest needs to be healed. This leads to monks on average taking more damage at the benefit of smoothing and safety. Now that we've seen some of the math and objectivity behind the numbers, it may leave you thinking that it doesn't match some of the things you hear or even some of the things that you've experienced. For starters, some tanks are less forgiving to play than others and therefore less mistake-friendly as a result. Commonly comparing safer tanks like Monk to less forgiving ones like DK or Paladin let you grasp the moment-to-moment decision-making that can leave the latter too floored. Now, I know what some of you must be saying, lol Sloot, that tank is so easy to play, how can you make mistakes, Kek W, Leo Kek, use code Sloot at checkout. Well, my young rowdy WoW player, people do make mistakes, and mileage varies from person to person. Some class concepts and tanking just comes more naturally to some people compared to others, and your experience may be wildly different. My mentions were specifically for objective mechanics of the classes. Furthermore, there tends to be an obsession with playing whatever the meta is and the assumption that people can just class swap and play it perfectly at all times, and any negative results must be because the class is weak, etc. I believe that too often people readily blame everything and anything they can before trying to self-analyze if they can improve their gameplay and if they made mistakes that they can fix. No one starts at a pro level, we all need to learn and grow. You will often perform better on a class that you're comfortable on, as long as relative balance is halfway decent, rather than trying something foreign to you that just doesn't click. Though we all dream of a world where balance isn't decent at all. Being constructively critical of your gameplay is important too. There are often small optimizations that can be made that will get you more mileage on each tank, along with taking a good look at talent and legendary options. I've seen all sorts of complaints like warrior is so bad against sustained magic damage, but all rage is dumped into revenge instead of ignore pain, or that paladin is getting trucked, but they aren't standing in consecrate for another 13+% mitigation. A final finer point to consider is healer familiarity, experience, and even psychology with the different tanks, especially if it's someone you don't often or ever play with. Don't you remember how awkward your first high school dance was, you nerd? Some DKs like tanks are much more prone to having a yo-yo health bar because they can heal that damage frequently, but to the untrained and external eye that can look like an emergency situation, causing use of resources and CDs that aren't really necessary for a trained tank, and so your attention from a healer by healer basis may differ. Hopefully this video helped you make a better judgment on what tank you'd like to play each tier, what they can bring, and most importantly, why. Or of course, if you still want to just follow meta suggestions or tier lists, we can still hold pinkies and have a whiskey. Or 7. Well, that does it for me. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and are enjoying the launch of patch 9.1. Make sure to hit that follow and subscribe button so I can afford another banana bed for my cats. Oh, and make sure to follow my Twitch as well to see daily egg cosplays.